To the class this morning about what I would be teaching on this evening goes along with the life of Sampson. And I ask, and there's a couple kind of snickered and said, well, I don't know where you're going to go with this story. And so I kind of ask you where we start with the story. Because what do you know about Sampson in the Bible? If you were asked and if you were to tell his story to someone, how would you tell it? You may start out with he was one of the judges in the Bible. I'd take that back. You probably wouldn't start there. That's probably a footnote. That's probably the last thing you remember of Sampson. I forgot. Yeah, he was one of the judges. Would you tell me of his long flowing hair? For it was not to be cut, going along with the strict Nazirite vow that his family vowed for his life. Would it be his overwhelming superhuman strength? Would it be tales of riddles and conquests? Or would it be the ultimate betrayal by the woman that he loves so much, Delilah? Any of those, it could be a starting point, and you could kind of finish up with it. But really the question for this evening is that really all that we get from the story? Is it the good, the betrayal, and the downright ugly? Because when you read the tales, especially when he gets involved in the wedding feast trials that go back and forth, it kind of can get a little disturbing. So we remember the ultimate failure time after time, and then even in the betrayal, we even questioned because she tested him and he kind of threw out some bad information and she took him up on that, and you thought, well, certainly you should see the light bulb coming on that she was trying to betray him, but nonetheless, he goes through with it. And as you read, at the end goes out with a big bang as he's finished off with his last heroic effort one last time as he regains his strength for just that brief moment with God's help so that he could take vengeance on those for taking out his eyes was his prayer. And of course, the pillars collapse, and it's the end of Sampson and those in that vicinity. As he was chained and killed off, so many at one time, as the Bible says, killing more in that time than all he did in his entire life. Now that would really be the story of Sampson, case closed, his life in a capsule, until you get to Hebrews 11:32. And that's what gets most of us to scratch our heads. Maybe that's really all the Old Testament story was, we think. Just an Old Testament saga and a lesson to be learned, until we get to Hebrews 11:32 in the New Testament. Now, it's kind of a footnote, and David's listed in there too, kind of a footnote, because the Hebrew writer goes, and we'll study this eventually in our class. We've not gotten there to Hebrews 11 yet. We're still in Hebrews chapter 4. But if you look at verse 32, it says, and what more shall I say? This has already gone on of the predicated faiths that were in the Bible. And it's kind of like, I'm going to cut this short, and time wouldn't allow me. He says, for the time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, and Samuel, and the prophets. So Samuel, David, they all get kind of a footnote. We all know their stories are a little bit more lengthy than this, than the Hebrew writer attaches to. But he's still in there. Samson, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. It's interesting because he is listed as a man of faith. Makes you want to go back and recount the story, doesn't it? Well, what does that tell us? Ultimately, what we find is that even after Samson's mighty failures, and what we need to hear tonight, he wasn't disqualified from God's family. Now, if that isn't grace going to the ultimate level, isn't that the best part of the story that's often forgot? The one that you first probably would not say is the story of Samson. Not on purpose, but we do miss that at times. It's yet another great example and display of what the good news that God has to offer to all of us, as it's still called today. Have we ever missed that remarkable fact? How it all ends is recorded in Judges 16. If you want to turn there for reference point, Judges 16, 28, and 30. It's the end of his life, and it reads this way. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. If we go back to the very beginning, Samson's parents were barren, but given this miracle child, an angel came to pronounce to them that you're going to have a boy and he is going to belong to God from the day he is born, and they did just that. Raised Sampson as a Nazirite. A person took a strict vow who belonged totally to the Lord. Now, we talked a little bit about this in class 2 about being born into something. So did that work out? Did it work out that Samson, of course, in the early portions of his life, when he was at home, it exactly worked out that way. But giving their son over to God for being blessed by the Lord, and as we read what happened next, can be said really out of any of us. We can choose to take another path. We can choose to have another walk, and without God, or ultimately leaving him behind. Because even though his parents decided for him of what his life should be and ought to be, sadly his life did not belong to the Lord. It belonged to Samson. And we too can be told in our story of the same path. We can be so lost by just serving ourselves the rest of our lives and really get caught up in love just doing that. No mention of the Bible that asks if we're to be a follower of his, to deny ourselves. Nothing of picking up a cross and following him. No reference to those who save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their lives will save it. And it's because Samson lets his passions and desires take over, just like we can. Though he grew up under God's blessings, all along his attention to other things drew him away. Paul had that happen to someone close to him, Demas, one of his friends. Now this gets off the track, but it just kind of shows you that you can even be going down the path and decide that in the middle of walking it, it isn't for you. Back in 2 Timothy 4:10, as a footnote from Paul in his letter, says, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Was serving, was on that path, and decided the world looked a little bit better, and his love for it and his pursuit for it. The same can be said of really of any of us right now. Samson allowed himself to be controlled by his desires and his appetites. And like most who are controlled under its power, just like his life showed, we saw to play out in the pages of the Old Testament, where perhaps maybe some of his closest friends, if he had those, saw that his life was out of control. You could kind of say way out of control, and could not be stopped, not only physically, but you could not change his mind. God told him not to intermarry, and that was his desire, to even be with a Philistine woman. He was very headstrong, you could say. Can that be said of us? Sure it can. Isn't that the case when we want to do what we want to do no matter what? And a lot of times others can see it. But sadly, sometimes we're the last to see it. I can be the last to figure it out. You can go back and read Judges 14 and 16, both those chapters, for example, which details all the drama and violence revolving around the wedding to kind of set the wheels in motion. A lot of times I thought, well, the only thing what Samson was doing is driving a wedge between his people and the Philistines. And he did drive that wedge. That wedge is so embedded now and would be a thorn in your side that's still that those two groups do not get together to this day. So that was started even way back then. But to then seeing his fits of rage and slaughters, and just like with us, As it was with Sampson, sometimes God lets us wander so we can discover the futility of life without him. Also, just like Solomon and others, we can see that came to that realization. What did he say? Well, it's all vanity. We say, well, it's easy for him to say he had everything. Exactly. Do we have to have everything in order to understand that it really isn't all what it's cracked up to be? Well, let me get a little taste of it, and then I can maybe answer you that. Some can come to realize what's truly important later. If you go and visit any of our older members, some of our older senior members in societies that you talk to, realize in their older age what's truly important. Time, family. It's not working more, gaining more money, padding my bank account. They're all going to be leaving that. They know that. In fact, you think from our standpoint, well, shouldn't they be sad? They're maybe in a retirement home and all they've got is this little apartment room. They don't really seem to be very bothered by it and very miserable about it. They're not crying to get me out of this prison of not having all the stuff that I want. See, they're not so wrapped up in the things of today. They tend to slow down and really focus on what's more important. It's like someone who's been diagnosed with an incurable disease. You hear this. They start to realize what? The importance of life. The importance of things in life. That my health can be taken from me. Just like that. They may not have seen it yesterday, but they see it today. I know they just announced, and anybody that follows sports, sportscaster Stuart Scott that died of cancer. He's had 2 major bouts with it over these past several years. But in his closing remarks, when he got an award, he talked about his family, talked about his daughters, talked about that was what life was all about, living for him. See, that's a refocus. When you have your career and everything's going well, and then you have this incurable disease that may take your life, then you realize what's more important. And in his mercy, God lets some of us wander sometimes, so we discover that we need him. That's the point. That's always been the point of the Bible. A lesson learned time after time from the Old Testament on as he showed his people and then asked the question, will you trust me? And with that, will you put your full trust in me? Because when you do, it's giving up something. It's called self. It's giving up of yourself when you're having to put your trust into someone else. And he still asks that of us today. In reverse, that's always been the tactic of Satan, having us question God. And since the garden, his message has always been the opposite. It's you can't trust God. He's really not looking out for you. And that's what he told Eve in the garden. With the deception of, he really doesn't love you because he's keeping you from something that looks good to eat and could open your eyes. And you could be like God. You could be on equal footing. See, so he really isn't looking out for your best interest. You can't trust God totally. If she and he, Adam and Eve, both put their trust in God during that temptation, they may have lived there for the rest of their lives and still be living today because there would be no sin in the garden. But we know that's not the case. And maybe there would have been another opportunity to trip them up later on because the tempter doesn't just come once. Even with Jesus, comes back another time. So the message is that he's really not looking out for you. He doesn't truly love you because he is keeping something from you, and that's not love. See, it's the same tact that he used on Jesus and what he wanted for him to do. And what was that? To take what's rightfully his. And he wanted Jesus to take it now and not wait on God. You don't have to do that. You can trust in yourself. If you were truly the Son of God, you could do all this. And he could. But what was he doing? He was being submissive to the Lord's will. And we hear that time and time again. Not my will, but the Lord's will be done. See, he wanted Jesus to say, you can take what's rightfully yours right now. And Jesus could have done any of those that Satan asked him to do. But he, for our sake, had to be a perfect sacrifice and as a man that emptied himself from his deity and was submissive to the Lord's will. How often we heard him say, Yet another example to be submissive to the Lord's will when even the Son of God did the same thing. He learned obedience. How can you learn obedience when you're a God? You answer to no one. He learned obedience through the things that he suffered, is what the scripture says. How sad that Sampson or any of us can live so far from the one who would ultimately fully satisfy us and whom we can put our complete trust in. Some others, however, never get it and never get the chance of seeing it. And eventually, God does release them to their desires as well, just like it says that it can do for any of us. God gave them over. You know the short list of what mankind can be given over to? Well, what can we be given over to? What is it that we really want over anything that God has prescribed? You can look at it for yourself in Romans 1, 28 through 32. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, it's the point. When you get to the point where you're not submissive, he's not the Lord of your life. And I don't see to fit acknowledge God in that way. God gave them over to a depraved mind to do the things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedience to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. See, I joked to you at the beginning to say it's a short list. As you can see, all walks of life out there have been given over to all of these things mentioned. And we too, verse 32, and although they did not know the ordinances of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them, to those who are engaged in these things. That really is no short list. And it's what we really want in our lives and can control us. And God giving over to a reprobate mind is not just a verse on him giving it over to homosexuality, which I've always heard it described as over everything else. And that is also found in this text, but starting back in verse 24. It can be that, but as you can see on that list, it can be so much more. It can be anything over God. And for Sampson, when that happened to him, he moved away from God. He lost everything before he realized what really was important. Perhaps as the start of a new year, it may seem that maybe that is how your life is described. It's really been a taking over. In reality, it's kind of been plaguing us. But the good news is, if you're still breathing, and it's still called today, there's hope. There's always hope. It wasn't too late for Sampson, and it's not too late for you or I, because let's not think it's so easy to come back to God after tragedy strikes. Now, I borrowed this and mentioned this in the class, so if you were here, then it's going to be a repeat. He could have died just as easy without reaching back to God when he lost everything. We know of stories that of people that have lost some things in life and have never come back, even to this day. Betrayed by someone that he loved, and here have his eyes gouged out and his life reduced to grinding in darkness at the prison mill. It wasn't over yet. Where most could conclude, what's the use? Look what God has given me now, as we recalled how his story ends. But see, God strengthened him once more, and he was able to topple those pillars, killing thousands. But that's not all. He just didn't go out in a cloud of dust, so to speak, because of Hebrews 11:32 brings it right back that he is listed as a man of faith. Now that is a story. Can we see that all of Samson's failure did not disqualify him from God's family? It shouldn't, because that's a story that shouldn't be missed. And we too, after straying, can come back to God? If it wasn't too late and he comes back to God, not left for him for good, he could have given up on God because of his failures. because he knew God to be faithful and he cried out to God. You notice that. He petitioned God. He prayed to God. See, there was still that belief system in him. You don't cry out to something that you don't believe in or no longer believed in because you walk away. Because as I listed in this morning class, that can happen too. And we see that even in our day. Quoting Christopher Reeves, said the late actor who died of injuries that made him crippled from the neck down, that once played a Superman. When asked after the incident that left him paralyzed if he now believes in God for possibly a miracle, that he could go pray out to God, his answer was, "Why should I? I never believed in him in the first place." So if you think it's easy, as the old expression says, there's no atheists in foxholes. Sure there are. There can be people that take pride right with them to the grave. Samson could have made that choice as well. That's why today we are to persuade men, because there's still time. There is still hope, as long as it's called today. And again, if it wasn't too late for Samson, it's not too late for us. I say that because you don't have to resign yourself to the way that you are today, fearing that you will never change. What's the use? This is who I am. You can be different. You can be transformed by the renewing of your minds and with God's help. Notice that Samson had to pray to God to gain his strength. He didn't say, well, this one last time, I with my strength is going to handle all this. But just like Samson had to learn not by his own power, he had to wait on God. He prayed out to God, and God answered. And it was God's strength given back to him in that mighty moment. He was weak, and God made him strong. And it's when we surrender back to him, just like Samson had done, because what he knew and remembered is what we should as well. God has promised that he would never leave us, nor forsake us. We can leave him, and we can leave him forever. But Samson's story shows that we can come back in the end, as long as it's called today. That's why I've even shared with the morning class, I don't struggle with deathbed repentance like a lot of people have problems with. And because the laborers in the field is supposed to be a teaching aid for both people. For the ones that complain, that's not fair. I lived a holy Christian life my whole life. And that's not fair. Then he says, well, when you signed up, you agreed. You agreed that heaven was your reward. You've not lost anything. And for the one to be able to come at the very last and acknowledge that they were lost and to come back at the last seconds, and it doesn't happen as often as you think. The teaching tool was for both. The one that agreed to work the entire day's wage got paid the same that came at the halfway point and the same that came at the last hour, because it was the master that distributed out the funds. How could it be for us to raise our hand and say, not fair, when he's done so much for us? And if we've lived a long life like that, what's there much to complain about? But be overjoyed if someone can see the same at the end. And we can come back as long as it's called today. That's the story of Samson. Because we can leave ultimately and completely. But Samson was faithful in the end. Can that be said of any of us? I hope that's an encouragement to you, as it's supposed to be there for our learning. So if we can help you with anything that's going on in your life, to pray with you or for you, or maybe you've never obeyed the gospel and we want to have that opportunity given as an invitation. Whatever your need is, if you have one, if you'll come now and make it known as we stand and as we sing.